Hi folks, and thanks for joining us. This is the first of a two-part YouTube series on preparing for DXpeditions. Now, it's aimed mainly at shortwave radio listeners, but it could also be quite useful for people who are only new into the amateur radio hobby, who haven't had their license that long, or who haven't done much in the way of transmitting away from their own home. So hope you find something that's of use to you. Because one of the joys of listening to shortwave radio is going portable. It is setting up the gear in a completely different location to discover what reception is like in some other part of the country, or indeed the world. As long as there's been radio enthusiasts, there have been DXpeditions. And it's just another part of the hobby that many of us have come to know and love. However, these days I think DXpeditions have also become a necessity, especially if you live in a small home or apartment with no space for external antennas. Or perhaps you're forced to live with a high level of man-made noise in your home listening environment, which is very, very common these days. For most DXs, long gone are the days when your place of residence was your best and most reliable location for listening. For many city dwellers, the chance of hearing some rare or exotic DX has become either extremely difficult or next to impossible. The local noise levels on the shortwave bands are just too high to dig out those weak signals. And this is where DXpeditions can come in, and they can take on many forms. It could be as simple as having an hour or so in the local park or a playground. Perhaps you could throw a radio in the car and drive off for a day in one of the national parks, or down by the beach, or high into the mountains. Or you might take some gear away with you on the next family holiday for a week or two. It could even involve gathering together a few fellow radio enthusiasts and renting a shack out in the country, or in the bush, as we Aussies are fond of saying. A few years ago, one of my friends was happily DXing off the coast of Africa while sitting on the deck of the famous Queen Mary ocean liner. Now, for most of us, however, a DXpedition is probably not going to be quite this fancy. But the possibilities of undertaking any type of DXpedition are really only limited by your imagination. In my teenage and young adult years, it was common for a group of us from the local radio club to have a weekend away by the beach or in the mountains. These days I tend to travel solo. For many years now I have taken myself off on trips around the country with a carload of gear, and I love it. More often than not, I will set up the car for a morning, afternoon or evening's listening. Occasionally I also find myself DXing from a holiday resort. However, usually these places, the holiday resorts, are full of the same electronic gadgets that I find in my neighbourhood, filling the shortwave bands with the same sort of electrical hash that I get at home, and sometimes worse. So my preference is for DXing from the car or the picnic table, well away from civilization and power lines. And while we're talking about power lines, these things are capable of radiating static and hash some miles away from the actual source of the pole. On a few occasions I found myself sitting in a forest, still hearing noise on the bands, only to find that it was coming from a faulty or a dirty insulator on a power pole a mile or so down the road. A DXing colleague of mine talks about the broadband electrical noise acting like a normal radio signal and actually propagating itself many miles away. On one day, I selected my DXing location in what I thought was a remote part of the forest. So I set the radio up and the long wire antenna and began tuning the bands. And I couldn't believe how much electrical noise was coming out of the receiver's speaker. I turned off the radio and started walking around to see if I could find out where the noise source was. I was in the forest. Eventually I discovered that through the trees, about 200 metres away from where I'd parked, sat several large farm sheds with agricultural machinery inside it chugging away. And that was what was making the noise. So it pays to check your location carefully before you start setting up the gear. Over the years, I've developed some strategies that have helped me to obtain the best results out of DXpeditioning. So here are a few things that might be helpful to think about before you start taking off on your next trip. What do you want to achieve on this DXpedition? Is it your goal to discover new or hard to hear stations? Are you aiming to send reception reports to these stations? If so, then as you gather together information for 20 to 30 minutes of program detail to include in your reception report, realise that that's time taken away from scanning the shortwave bands for other interesting stations. Now that's not a problem if your goal is to QSL new broadcasters, as long as you understand that in your quest to chase a QSL card, you actually have less time at your destination for hearing other stations. But perhaps your goal is to try and, hear as many stations as possible on your trip. Band scanning then becomes the focal point of your DXpedition. This goal is quite rewarding in itself. You get to experience listening in another location away from your home. As a result, you learn a lot more about what's going on the shortwave bands, especially the stations that you were possibly missing out on hearing at home. Consider also how long you want your DXpedition to last. Will you be away for the afternoon or the evening, perhaps a few hours? Or will you be on holiday, perhaps camping in a forest or by the seaside for several days or a week? If you're going to be away for a few days, then you possibly have time to do both band scanning and detailed listening for certain stations for the specific purpose of gathering information to include in a reception report. What times of the day are you planning to listen to the shortwave bands? If you intend to switch on the radio in the middle of the day in high summer, you could be disappointed because you may not hear too much on the bands. Evenings, early mornings and daytime reception in midwinter will usually yield the best results. Are you able to predetermine the propagation conditions in your chosen listening location? What parts of the world would you hear at various times of the day from that location? Will these signals be coming via the long path or the short path to your receiving location? Spending time thinking about the best listening periods and the likely stations to be heard will help focus your listening even more and achieve better efficiency with your time during the trip. If you are listening for only a few hours, then it's really important to know where to look, in other words, what bands are going to be open, and what to look for, what stations are likely to be broadcasting. In real estate, it's often said that what matters is three things: location, location, and location. And as I've already indicated earlier here in this video, an important part of a successful DXpedition is also about picking the right location. The aim is to operate in an environment that is free of localised man-made noise. Such a location will give you the best chance of hearing weak signals. This is a major advantage of DXpeditions. It's amazing how much difference a quiet location can make to your listening endeavours, potentially revealing all sorts of stations that you cannot hear at home. So, I cannot overemphasise the importance of selecting a really good DX location. Look for remote locations that are well away from residences and commercial areas. Stay well away from power lines. They can radiate electrical hash for many miles. Even rural farming locations can be a problem sometimes, especially if electric fences are used to keep the cattle on the right side of the fence, which is a big problem here in Australia. Good sites to consider are forests, open bushland and mountainous regions. Destinations by the sea can also be fantastic as long as there are no power lines nearby, because you find that corroded connections and salt-encrusted power insulators can create much hash across the shortwave bands, making you feel like that you've moved to a home away from home. Space for antennas is another consideration. If your location is in national parks or state forests, then you'll probably have plenty of space to roll out a nice long antenna. However, if you're planning to operate from a camping ground or a holiday shack or other privately owned land, then you'd better seek permission before erecting that beverage antenna. The last thing you want to do is to hang one of the local residents by your antenna. So, that's the end of part 1 of this video. In part 2, we're going to look at the gear that you need to gather together for a successful DXpedition. What types of radios, what types of antennas, any auxiliary equipment, useful resources, and all the creature comforts necessary for making your trip an enjoyable one. So, zip over to part 2 of this presentation, but before you do, if you found this video useful, give us a like. If you didn't find this video useful, well then give us a like anyway. 73 and good DX to you all.